Story 1.
I never imagined that a weekend alone at the cabin could bring me something so scary. The idea was simple: get away from everything. No electricity, no internet, just me and the tranquility of the forest. I was alone. It was a place I rented from time to take a break from the routine. The cabin was simple but had that rustic charm. Night fell early, as always, and soon I was in absolute silence. I was already getting used to the sound of wood creaking, the wind outside, the sound of some animal in the distance. It was a peace that made me feel small in the face of the immensity of the forest. But something that night was different. It was around 11:30 a.m. when I heard the landline ringing. That phone, which had been there for years and never worked, was ringing. I confess that I hesitated for a moment. The cabin had no electricity, much less a telephone line. I couldn't understand what could be happening. I went to the device and, still in disbelief, picked up the phone. The only thing I could hear was faint, barely audible breathing and a low voice that, with difficulty, repeated, "You know where I am." I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but the voice was broken, as if it were sick or injured. What gave me chills was the fact that after saying that, the call just dropped. I stood there, motionless, holding the phone, trying to process what had just happened. The moment the call dropped, I was frozen, not knowing what to do. I tried to rationalize it, but there was no explanation. How could someone call a number that should be out of service? The cabin was far from any civilization, and that phone had never been turned on in years. I looked at the device for a long time, as if waiting for something else to happen. But nothing. I went back to the couch and tried to distract myself, trying not to think about it. However, with every crack of wood or snap of branches outside, I felt more restless. It was as if something was watching me. I looked at the clock. It was already past 1 a.m. The forest was quieter now, but the feeling of unease only grew. I couldn't fall asleep. With every strange noise, my heart accelerated. I was starting to question my sanity, but when I looked out the window, my blood ran cold. Outside on the porch, I saw what looked like a pair of fresh footprints right in front of the door. There were large shoe prints, as if someone had walked there while I was inside the cabin. That someone was very close, but where did he come from? I didn't see any cars on the dirt road. There was no one else in the immediate vicinity, and no sign of other people for miles. I was completely alone. Fear took over me, but I couldn't stop looking at those marks, leading to the main forest trail. A strange feeling invaded me. Something told me it wasn't safe to stay there. I knew I had to act quickly, so I locked all the doors and windows, but the feeling that something was behind it all only grew. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to the smallest sounds from the house and the forest. Each crack sounded more ominous than the last. In the morning, I decided that I would go out to investigate. Something told me that if I stayed there, it would only get worse. I picked up my backpack, packed some food, and went to the porch. The shoe prints were still there, clear and visible, as if they had been waiting for me. The air was cold and damp, and the cloudy sky did nothing to help my feeling of restlessness. I followed the footprints, trying to ignore the fear that was beginning to consume me. The shoe prints were fresh, still with traces of damp earth that made them impossible to ignore. They were heading in the direction of the main trail, but when I reached the trailhead, something was strange. There were no other marks left, as if whoever it was had disappeared. I looked around, trying to detect any sign of movement. Nothing. Everything was still, immense, and the forest seemed more oppressive than I was starting to doubt everything that was happening there. But something told me that I should continue. The feeling of being watched made me quicken my steps. But as I went deeper into the trail, the silence became heavier, as if something was about to happen. I walked for over an hour, getting further and further away from the cabin, without seeing anyone. The forest seemed endless, and over time, I began to feel more lost than before. The silence was dense, and there were no longer any sounds of animals or wind, as if the environment around me had ceased to exist. That's when I noticed something strange in the trees ahead. It looked like there was something written on the bark of a tree. Getting closer, I saw that they were not words, but marks, as if someone had scratched hard. The design was a strange pattern, almost like a symbol, but I didn't recognize anything. As I looked closer, I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if those marks were watching me back. I decided to go back, not knowing exactly what to think. The feeling of being followed was stronger than ever. I felt like I was no longer alone there, even without seeing or hearing it. As I turned to follow the path back to the cabin, I saw something in the corner of my vision, a shadow, standing between the trees. It stopped my heart for a second. I looked toward the main trail, trying to see what was there, but as I took another step, the shadow disappeared. I had no doubt. Something was. The worst thing was that, even with this growing fear, the voice from the previous night's call echoed in my head. You know where I am. Now I knew, and that only made everything seem even more terrifying. Who was behind? I returned to the cabin as quickly as I could, but the feeling that I was being followed wouldn't leave. The air was thick, and the sound of the wind in the trees seemed heavier and heavier, as if something was trying to hide among the branches. When I got back, I locked the door and started looking for any sign that someone had broken in. There was nothing unusual inside the cabin, but fear had already taken over. I didn't know what to think anymore. The call, the footprints, the shadow in the forest. It was all making me paranoid. I went to the window and looked out, hoping to see some sign of life. Nothing. The forest was as silent as before. However, when I looked up at the porch again, I noticed something that made my insides freeze. The shoe prints, the same ones I had seen in the morning, were now deeper, as if someone had returned. They were much closer to the door, as if they were surrounding me. I didn't understand how this was possible. There was no one else around, and I knew I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. Panic started to take over me, and I started looking for anything that would make me feel safe. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, just to have something to defend myself with, and hid in the corner of the room, watching the door. I was so tense I could barely breathe. Every sound seemed to come from much closer. I spent hours there, in the corner of the room, feeling time pass slowly, as if with every minute that dragged on, the tension increased. The fear was so real that it stopped me from doing anything, even looking at the marks on the porch again. But then something happened that made me completely lose track of everything around. A faint knock on the front door. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to make me jump in fright. I stood there, motionless, listening for a few more seconds. There was no longer any knocking, but the silence made me even more tense. Was it someone trying to get in? I was sure there was no one else in the immediate vicinity, and yet that scared me more than anything else before. I slowly got up and went to the door, with the knife still in my hand. Fear prevented me from making any noise. I looked through the cracks in the window, but I didn't see any. That moment of tension lasted what seemed like an eternity. Finally, I decided to open the door, even though I knew it could be a mistake. When I slowly opened it, what I saw on the porch made me tremble with fear. There was no one there, but something was still wrong. There was a piece of paper on the stairs, folded neatly. I hesitated before picking it up, but instinct to know what was happening forced me to do. I unfolded the paper, and as soon as I read it, I felt the blood freeze in my veins. You know where I am. The same words as the call, but this time the lyrics were much clearer and seemed written with a strange urgency, as if someone was trying to warn me, or worse, challenge. I stood there for a long time, holding that piece of paper, trying to understand what was happening. The words were there, embedded in my mind, and somehow they seemed to echo in the air around. I looked into the forest, looking for any sign of movement, but everything was still. The silence was absolute, and I knew something was about to happen, but I had no idea. I needed to get out of there, but a part of me was afraid to just walk away, as if I turned my back on that, he would come at. The worst part was that I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was my own paranoia. The feeling of being watched was in every corner of the cabin. In every step I decided that I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my things, gathered what I could, and headed to the door. But before I left, something stopped me. The landline phone rang. I almost couldn't move. My heart was beating fast. It wasn't possible. I had unplugged that device earlier, and it was still ringing. I went there, eyes wide, and when I picked up the phone, I could only hear that faint voice again, the same one I heard during the... This time, she sounded closer, more desperate. "You know where I am." But before I could react, the line cut off abruptly and silence returned. I dropped the phone on the floor, without the strength to react. When I looked at the door, the shoe prints were there again, more visible than ever, as if something had approached once again. I didn't know what to do, so I just ran to the trail without looking back. I ran as fast as I could down the trail, fear consuming me with every step. The forest was silent, but I could feel the presence of something there, watching me. I didn't dare look back, but I knew the footprints were still there, following me. As he advanced, the sound of the forest seemed to disappear completely. Only my heart pounding and the sound of my boots breaking dry branches were audible. I was lost in my own thoughts, trying to find some explanation for it all. But no explanation made sense. The feeling that something was hunting me was too real to ignore. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew something or someone was following. That's when I finally saw the main road. The feeling of relief was instantaneous, but I couldn't relax. Something inside me said I wasn't free. When I got to the car, I saw that the doors were open, as if someone had tampered with it. I knew I hadn't left them open. Panic took me again, but I decided not to hesitate any longer. I quickly got into the car and, with shaking hands, put the key in the ignition. There was no more time. When I finally managed to get out of the forest and onto the main road, I realized that I was relieved but at the same time deeply afraid. Something in me knew this wasn't over. I didn't understand how, but that day seemed to have no end. And the worst part, to this day, I don't know what really happened. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain what I experienced in that place.
Story 2.
I've never been a big fan of hiking, but that weekend, my wife insisted we take the kids out to get some fresh air. It was a popular national park, so I thought there would be no problem. We followed a well-marked trail that led to a viewpoint, and honestly, the view was amazing. We managed to take some photos. The children ran around the place, and when the sun started to go down over the horizon, we decided to go back. I looked at the clock. We still had a good hour before it got completely dark, so I figured it would be fine. The trail was clearly marked on the way there, so what could go wrong? At first, everything seemed the same. The trees, the sound of birds, the rustle of leaves beneath our feet. But at some point, the trail started to look. It wasn't obvious. It was just a feeling that we were walking more than we should have. It was my youngest daughter who asked first, "Haven't we been here before?" I looked around and noticed that the markers that should have been on the trees, those stripes of paint or plaques, were gone. I tried to remain calm, saying that we must have lost our way for a moment, but inside, I began to feel that familiar tug of anxiety. We continued walking, trying to find any sign of the original trail. My oldest son suggested we go back, but when I looked back, I realized it didn't. The forest looked the same in every direction, as if we were spinning in circles without realizing it. My heart started to beat fast. My wife suggested we call for help. But of course, we were in the middle of nowhere, and there was no cell phone reception. It was at that moment that I realized how silent the forest had. No wind, no birds, just the sound of our boots crunching dry leaves. That silence was strange, uncomfortable. It was already starting to get dark when we found something that seemed completely out of place. An old backpack leaning against a fallen log. It wasn't just the fact that she was there that bothered me, but the way she looked, abandoned. There was no dirt on it, nor was it torn, but it had clearly been there for a... Next to her, a pair of worn-out shoes, also abandoned. I approached slowly, trying to understand what I was seeing. I called my wife to look, but she just shook her head, asking us to continue. There was no sign of anyone nearby. No sounds, no voices, no tracks. Just that. We decided to move on, but that scene stuck in my head. Who leaves a backpack and shoes in the middle of the forest, and why? It didn't make sense. As we walked, I started to feel like something was really wrong. The children were tired and started to complain, so I tried to distract them by telling them that we would soon find the... But every minute, it became harder to believe that. It felt like the terrain was... The trees were closer together. The branches seemed to close around us, and the ground, which had previously been covered in leaves, was now full of thick, irregular... It was like we were going to a place where no one When the sun finally disappeared, darkness took over everything. We turned on the flashlights we had brought, but the light seemed... I know it sounds strange, but it was as if the dark was dense, absorbing part of the light. My wife held my hand tightly, and I noticed she was... The children were also scared, even without saying anything. It was then that we heard it. First, it was a faint sound, almost like very distant footsteps. I thought it was our imagination, but the more we stopped to listen, the clearer it became. Steps, slow, calculated, coming from somewhere behind. My instinct was to look back, but all I saw was darkness. The flashlight light didn't reach far enough, and the sound of footsteps stopped as I turned. My wife whispered, "Did you hear?" I nodded, confirming, but I didn't know what to say to reassure her. We continued walking, faster now, trying to ignore the feeling that something was following us. But every few minutes, the sound returned, light footsteps, but close enough to give us goosebumps. The children began to cry softly, and I knew that if I didn't remain calm, we would all panic. At one point, I tripped over something on the floor and almost fell. It was another pair of shoes, but this time they were even older and full of... What chilled me was realizing that there were no footprints around, as if the shoes had simply appeared there. My wife was behind me and saw... She tugged on my arm and whispered, "We need to get out of here now." I agreed, but where? We were completely lost, and that sound of footsteps seemed to be playing with us, appearing and disappearing, always maintaining the same distance, as if he knew exactly where we were. All the despair began to take over. There was no longer a clear path, and the darkness was so impenetrable that I could barely see the outlines of the trees in front of us. The flashlights didn't help. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I started walking without stopping, pulling my family behind me. I don't know how long we walked like that, but it felt like an eternity. I was beginning to lose hope of finding any way out, when finally I saw something that stopped me in the middle of the trail. A shadow. It wasn't a tree, it was a figure, standing in front of us, as if it was waiting. I stood still for a second, trying to understand what my eyes were seeing, but the figure was in a place where the flashlight light couldn't reach well. I could barely make it out, but it looked huge. It wasn't possible. There was no one there before. And then suddenly, this appeared out of nowhere. The most terrifying thing was that there was no movement, just a static and opaque presence, like an empty figure. Watching. My wife started to cry softly, and that's when I really felt a chill run down my spine. The air was thick, heavy, and the feeling that it wasn't human consumed me. The figure remained there, motionless, as if it was just watching us. We didn't make any moves. Nobody said anything. I wanted to run, but my legs didn't respond. It felt like fear was paralyzing me. Then, without warning, the figure disappeared, as if it had never been. The sound of footsteps, which until then seemed distant, disappeared once, and I looked around, trying to find some sign, anything that would tell me it was just an illusion. But there was nothing but darkness and silence. The feeling of being lost, completely out of control, became even stronger. I didn't know what to do, but I knew we couldn't stay there any. After what seemed like an endless amount of time, we finally found a road that took us back to the park. There were no more signs of anyone, and the trail we followed no longer made any sense. When we finally reached the car, the night was already well advanced, and the feeling of relief was enormous. But there was also an inexplicable fear. How is it possible for someone to get lost like that, for no apparent reason, in such a popular place? To this day, I can't explain what happened. I just know something was there, following us, and we may never know what it was.
Story 3.
I never imagined that a simple camping trip with my friends at UCLA could turn into something so disturbing. It's been 3 weeks since that night, but I still wake up in a cold sweat and with the feeling of being watched. There were 5 of us, me, Josh, Amanda, Mike, and Sarah, all in the same biology course, needing a break after finals in December. The idea of camping in Angeles National Forest seemed perfect at the time, as we knew the area well and had been there several times before. Sarah even joked that it would be our last outing together before winter break, but it ended up being the kind of experience neither of us will forget, for the worst possible reason. We arrived at the place around 2 in the afternoon, on a quiet Friday. The weather was perfect for camping, around 65 to 4F, with that typical California clear sky. We chose a more isolated area, about a 40-minute walk from the main entrance to the reserve, close to a stream that we used to frequent. The location was ideal because it was in a small natural clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees that provided good protection from the wind. We set up 3 tents, one for Amanda and Sarah, one for Josh and Mike, and one just for me because I've always had trouble sleeping while snoring. We spent the afternoon fishing, barbecuing, and drinking a few beers, like any normal group of college students would do. Nothing could have prepared us for what was about to happen. The sun started to set around 5:30, and that's when things started to get weird. At first, it was just some distant sounds that sounded like muffled laughter. Everyone listened, but no one paid much attention after all. It was a public camping area, and it was normal to have other groups around, even though it was low season. Mike even commented that it must be a group of young people enjoying it, just like us. We continued sitting around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling silly college stories. But as night fell, those laughs became closer and different. I don't know how to explain it properly, but there was something wrong with the way they sounded. It was as if they were forced, a bit mechanical, always in the same tone and duration. By 8 p.m., the situation was already making everyone tense. The laughter was now coming from different directions, as if we were surrounded. But we couldn't see anyone through the trees with our flashlights. Sarah, who was always the bravest of the group, grabbed her most powerful flashlight and tried to shout, "Hello, is anyone there?" But got no response. Only that strange laughter continued, now interspersed with sounds of branches breaking, as if several people were moving around us. Amanda began to cry softly, and I noticed that Josh was gripping the knife so tightly that his knuckles were white. The worst part was that it didn't make sense. If it were other campers trying to scare us, why didn't they just show up? And if they were criminals, why just tease us for so long? Mike suggested we go into the tents and try to sleep, saying it was probably just a group of stupid teenagers trying to scare us. But there was something about the way he spoke, with his voice shaking, that made it clear that he didn't even believe it himself. We entered the tents around 9:30, but no one could sleep. The laughter and noises in the forest continued for hours. At some point, I heard footsteps very close to my tent, slow, shuffling footsteps, as if someone was going around and examining every inch of the fabric. I stood frozen, barely breathing, as I held my cell phone. There was no signal there, but that device was my only connection to the normal world, so I clutched it as if it were some kind of protective amulet. It must have been around 3 a.m. when everything suddenly went silent. The silence was so abrupt that it seemed even scarier than the laughter. It was as if someone had pressed a button and turned off all the sounds of the forest at once. Not even crickets or owls could be heard anymore. I lay there, in a cold sweat, trying to make as little noise as possible. At some point, exhausted, I ended up falling asleep. When I woke up with the first rays of sunlight, my first thought was that everything had been just a crazy nightmare caused by the stress of exams or the horror stories we had told. But as soon as I left the tent, I realized that the nightmare was far from over. The others' tents were all open, but not in a normal way. The entrances had been completely undone, as if someone had pulled the zippers on both sides at the same time until they burst. By some miracle, my tent was the only one left intact. Josh and Mike were sitting on a fallen log, looking like they hadn't slept at all, and the girls were hugging each other by the unlit fire. But the worst part wasn't the destroyed tents, it was the rest of the camp. Our backpacks had all been opened and rummaged through, but in a methodical, bizarre way. Each item had been taken out and placed on the floor in perfectly straight lines, as if someone had organized everything by size. The beer cans, the snack packets, even our clothes, everything lined up with sickening precision. Sarah was the first to notice that some things were missing. The diary she always carried on trips was gone, along with all the printed photos that Amanda kept in her wallet. Mike didn't find his old watch, the one he had received from his grandfather. But the strangest thing is that our cameras and cell phones were left behind. Whoever did that wasn't interested in stealing valuables. It was as if they had only taken personal items, things with sentimental value. While we were trying to understand what had happened, Josh remembered that he had a GoPro camera installed in a tree. He always recorded our camps to make videos for YouTube. We ran to check, but when we got there, the camera was intact, except the battery had been removed and placed on the floor, perfectly aligned with the lens. After that GoPro discovery, no one wanted to stay there another minute. We gathered our things as quickly as possible, not even bothering to fold tents or organize anything properly. The sun was already high. It must have been around 8 in the morning, and for the first time we could clearly see the marks on the ground around the camp. There were footprints everywhere, but they didn't make any sense. Some looked normal, from sneakers or boots, but others were different, as if the person was walking on tiptoe, leaving very deep and narrow marks. And they all seemed to start and end out of nowhere, as if whoever made them had simply appeared and disappeared at different points. In my rush to get out of there, I ended up tripping over a root and falling near a denser bush. It was then that I saw something that makes me doubt my sanity to this day. Tucked between the branches was a Polaroid. It was a photo of the 5 of us sitting by the campfire the night before. The image was shaky and dark, taken from a strange angle, as if someone was photographing us hidden among the trees. But the worst thing, what made me vomit right then and there, were the faces in the photos. We were all smiling in a strange, forced way, exactly like those laughs we heard during the night. I showed the photo to the others as we ran back to the main trail, but no one could look at it for more than a few seconds. Mike snatched the photo from my hand and tore it into pieces, throwing everything into the air as we ran. We reached the parking lot in record time, practically running the entire way. When we finally reached the cars, Josh immediately called the park administration on his cell phone. We now had a signal. The guard who answered seemed confused by our story. He said he had no record of anyone else camping in that area the night before, and that even that specific part of the trail had been marked as closed for maintenance 2 weeks ago. He even showed the map at the entrance post. It had a clear red marking over the region where we camped, with prohibited area warnings that were definitely not there when we arrived the day before. The guard even tried to go up with us to check the place, but no one in the group had the courage to go back there. It's been almost a month, and I still haven't been able to sleep properly again. Sarah dropped out of college and returned to her parents' home in Oregon. Josh and Mike continue studying at UCLA, but they never talk about that night again. They literally change the subject if someone mentions camping or Angeles National Forest. Amanda is the only one who still talks to me about what happened. Last week, she sent me a message saying that she was searching online and found other similar reports in the same area. People hearing strange laughter, having personal belongings stolen, finding their things organized in bizarre patterns. Some even mentioned mysterious photos. But whenever she tries to go back to these sites or forums to show me, the pages are down or the posts have been deleted. Yesterday, I received a letter with no return address in my mailbox. Inside was just a torn piece of a Polaroid, the same piece that showed my face smiling disturbingly that night. Behind the photo was a handwritten message, "We miss your laughs." The paper lined up perfectly with the corner of the envelope, in the same meticulous way we found our belongings that morning. I showed it to Amanda, and she confessed that she also received something similar, but in her case, it was a page from Sarah's lost diary, with the same message written over the original text. We tried to tell the police, but they didn't take it seriously. They said it was probably just some colleague playing a bad joke. This is actually the first time I am writing about this in detail. I decided to share it here because I need to know if anyone else has experienced something similar in that region. I have nightmares almost every night about those laughs, and sometimes, when I am alone at home, I have the terrible feeling that I am being watched. The worst part is that since I got that photo, I've noticed strange things happening. Objects shifting around when I am not looking, always perfectly aligned, and sometimes, late at night, I could swear I hear distant laughter coming from nowhere. I know it sounds crazy, and maybe I am just being paranoid, but after that night, I can't doubt anything. If anyone here has experienced something like this, or knows that area of the forest, please tell me. I need to know that I am not alone.